Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Regulatory Experts Guide to a Successful FDA Meeting, presented by Cardinal Health. I'm Mary Grace, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'd like to start off by introducing today's speakers from Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences. We have Christine Bentley, Managing Director, Rob Baker, Director of Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Controls, Adam Chadwick, Medical Writer, Dr. Michelle Wilson, Manager of Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Controls, and Shanna Azri-Mian, Director of Regulatory and Product Development Non-Clinical at Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just to go over a few housekeeping items before we begin. To access additional resources for today's presentation, please click on the Handouts tab button on the left side of your screen. You can access closed captions from the bottom right corner of the video player. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand within 24 hours. But don't forget, we'd love to hear from you. During the presentation, please submit any questions you have using the Question and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. And time permitting, we will conclude with a Q&A session. With all of that said, we are ready to begin. Christine, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mary Grace, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, and for some of you, it may even be evening. I'm glad that you were able to make time to come to our Regulatory Experts Guide to a Successful FDA Meeting. Please know that this is a very high-level meeting to discuss the ins and outs of actually making arrangements with the FDA to have a meeting on your specific submissions. As presented, our presenters are Shauna, Adam, Michelle, and Rob. And again, you can find their bios if you click on, I believe Mary Grace said to the right, and you can learn about each of our individuals that are supporting this seminar. For the agenda, we are going to be looking at my glasses. We're going to understand the evolving FDA meeting landscape. We're going to discuss the critical preparation needed and our learnings for Pre-IND, Pre-NDA, Pre-BLA meeting with the FDA. We're going to summarize the key steps that will help make your meetings with the FDA successful, and we are going to go into a Q&A session if time allows. So with the evolution of the FDA meetings, I'd like to turn it over to Shauna.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everyone. I thought I'd start with an introduction to give you an idea of FDA, how it's changed, how it's stayed constant, and also alert you to the different types of meetings that you may need to attend for your submissions. The FDA was created in 1906 by Teddy Roosevelt, whereby the Food and Drug Act was passed by Congress. It has now grown to 8 centers that range from veterinary medicine to foods to drugs, medical devices, etc. And in order to stay current, the FDA is constantly evolving with new therapies such as cell and gene therapies. There's new guidances looking at autologous therapies. There's always new therapies and orphan drugs. They're constantly evolving, addressing issues so they can stay one step ahead. There have been impacts of court hearings and rulings, and that includes powers that increase the FDA's powers and evaluations, public knowledge base, and there have also been some impacts on FDA with drugs that have been pulled from the market from a judgment standpoint and not from a scientific one. Transformations in the industry has also changed. For instance, genetically modified foods. How do we keep care of that? The supply chain, toxins, and climate change, how everything's changing. FDA addresses all of these and continues to be current and moving with the pace of research. What has remained the same? The commitment to safety is something that FDA is constantly seeking and remains constant. FDA remains a scientific, evidenced organization that looks at multidisciplinary pathways for regulation of drugs. In another area that it stayed pretty constant is the non-clinical requirements, that animal studies requirements for drugs has not changed over the last 30 years. However, it is also moving with the times. It's taken a leaf out of the European Union, and now it's possible that maybe rat carcinogenicity studies are not required, which saves companies millions of dollars and also 2 years of time. So FDA is not just, it is also very becoming more sponsor friendly, if you will. Let me go to the next slide here. All right. So why do you do an FDA meeting? The point is that you want to create a viable regulatory strategy that will behoove you and get you to approval. You want to know anything that FDA might come up during your product development timelines to make sure that you are in sync with FDA, and that'll help your approval process and prevent clinical hold. That's very important. So meetings between a sponsor are especially important. You need to do these probably early on when you have some data to go show proof of concept. When you have a basic tox package, this is typically done for a pre-IND meeting, maybe after phase 2, or maybe before an NDA or a BLA. These are the stages that you can, and you can always submit a written request at any time during your product development process. So what are the types of FDA meetings? There's several of them. One is Interact. This is relatively new for CDER. And basically it's taking proof of concept studies and going forward to FDA and saying, are we on the right track? Can we, and this is especially important for autologous therapies, whereby you want to get a permission from FDA that you don't need an in vivo study. You can do it totally in vitro based on the immunological differences between animals and people, obviously. The other type of meeting is a type A meeting, and this is granted within 45 days. This is usually to address a specific issue, such as clinical hold. If you've addressed the issue, you want to go to FDA and say, look, we had this issue. Now we've resolved it. Are we good to go? The most common type of meeting is a type B meeting. This can be done at pre-IND, pre-NDA, pre-IND. This is the type of meetings that's most commonly done. They're typically 1 hour in length. This is, again, the most common type of meeting, and it can be done at any stage of your development process. A type C is basically a specific question that may not be covered in a type B meeting. And a type D meeting is relatively new again. And this it's a very narrow window for a question. You can only ask 2 questions, and you cannot involve more than 3 disciplines. So it's a very narrow scope to ask a very specific question to the FDA. So what are the formats? Typically, back in the day, everything was face-to-face before COVID. And when you go to an FDA meeting and have a face-to-face meeting, I would recommend that you go ahead and budget plenty of time, because it's like going to the airport. There's security checks. You don't want to be late. The sponsor is the one to start the meeting, and then you go right into questions. Don't discuss the company. They've seen your questions. They know what you're about. Just go straight into the issues. You can also have a teleconference, which is comparable to a face-to-face meeting. Again, you want to be in a quiet room, be respectful, and again, focus on your issues. Get the answers you need. First and foremost, achieve your objective. Then now with COVID having entered our lives, most meetings are now virtual face-to-face meetings. And this is usually by Zoom. Try to make sure all your disciplines are represented in one room, so it's cohesive. And the last one is a written response only, and that can be done at any stage of your process. The advantage of a written response is that you can send a question in to FDA, your questions rather, and get your answers. And that may predispose you to not even having a face-to-face meeting. If your questions are all answered, you may not need a meeting at all. So based on that, I will now pass the baton to my colleague, Adam Chadwick, who will tell you how to request a meeting with FDA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shana. Hello. So after you have decided that it is important to have a meeting with the FDA, you have to request it. And for these, there are guidelines and procedures. When a meeting is needed, you must submit a written request to the FDA through the appropriate channels, and requests should be addressed to the appropriate center and review division or office, and if previously assigned, you can submit your request to the IND or NDA or BLA application number. There is a list of information that should be included in the request, but key for a successful request, there are the list of requested questions that should have an explanation of the context and also the purpose of each question. Also, the objectives of the meeting, the summary of completed and planned studies, and of course, the proposed agenda. However, you should also provide the application number, the product name, the proposed indications, the meeting type, the suggested dates and times, and the proposed meeting format, although it is the FDA that ultimately will decide the format. And of course, the list of proposed attendees from the sponsor side, but you can also suggest FDA staff members that should be involved. To increase the probabilities that the meeting will be granted, follow the guidance of industry format meetings between the FDA and the sponsor or applicants. The information included in the meeting request needs to be easy to read and understand, and ensure that questions are clear and concise. And when suggesting meeting dates and times, ensure all team members are available for all dates. After submitting the request, you can expect that the FDA will review the request and determine the most appropriate format. Requests for meetings will be granted if the sponsor is at the appropriate stage of development to make such meeting as productive as possible. And if a meeting request is denied or granted, the FDA will notify the requester in writing. So now I will let my colleague Michelle to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Got him. We're going to move on to preparing for a meeting. And a big part of preparing for the meeting is the briefing document. It's based on the meeting request. And really, I would suggest that when you draft your meeting request, you also draft your briefing document, because that will help you define what questions you need to ask and if you have enough background to have those questions answered. In your briefing document, you might have a couple of revised questions. You may have rethought things, and that's probably okay. But you want to keep any new questions to a minimum. If you have a brand new question that was not in your meeting request, but it is in your briefing document, there's a chance FDA may need to call in another expert, and that expert may or may not have that time available to attend the meeting, so they might have to reschedule the meeting. And you want to make sure your briefing document, which is usually a very long document, is well written, well organized, and professional. And make sure you pay attention to the small details like spell checking and formatting, and put it up on the screen and make sure it looks fine when it is viewed electronically, because that's usually how they're submitted. So once you've prepared for your meeting, the next thing you have to prepare for is for your responses to your questions. If you're meeting in person, the best thing to do is to reserve a meeting room where all your team can meet. If you're traveling, usually a hotel meeting room is reserved. If this is going to be virtual, reserve a Zoom time meeting so everybody can attend. Everybody waits in anticipation for your responses to be received, which they're usually received between 12 and 48 hours prior to the meeting date. And once they're received, the team all gets together, looks at the responses, and decides which questions, if any, actually, needs further discussion or clarification during the FDA meeting. It might be that you only need clarification on one question. It might be several questions. If you're really, really lucky, you might not need clarification on any of the questions, and you don't actually have to have the meeting. Assuming you do need some clarification on questions, you want to decide who's going to ask which question, and that usually goes by discipline. And you want to assign a note taker. This note taker usually doesn't say anything, but they're really important. You want to assign someone who can type nearly as fast as people talk, because you want as much of a transcript of the meeting as possible. And you also want to assign a lead who's going to moderate the meeting flow and keep time. So when you decide which questions need clarification, you're going to then prioritize which one you want to discuss first and how much time you're going to spend on each question. So your top priority question you might want to spend 20 minutes on, and then maybe 5 minutes on the rest. So your lead moderator is going to keep track of the time for each question and then move along to the next question so that you get all your questions answered. And probably the most important thing is rehearse. So once you've decided all your questions that you need clarification from, which ones are most important, you want to rehearse asking the question and also answering it yourself. Pretend at least someone in the group should pretend they're the FDA, and make sure that the questions you're asking, you really need to ask. You don't want to ask a question that could be easily answered by a guidance, for example. On your meeting day, just like Shauna said, you want to get there early if you're coming in person. You want to be on the phone early if it's a virtual meeting. If it's in person, definitely reserve transportation ahead of time. It's usually pretty easy to do if you're meeting in person as a group. There's usually buses you can reserve so that you're all on one bus. If you're meeting in person, again, bring all your required identification. And also take only what's necessary. You don't want to hold up the security line by having to check 4 bags through the security line, for example. Whether it's virtual or in person, you always want to have a debrief after the meeting. Even though you're going to have a very excellent note taker, everyone's going to hear something slightly different. So you want to make sure that you consolidate everyone's views and work on the meeting minutes. You want to get those meeting minutes all consolidated and all finalized and to the FDA within 24 hours after the meeting, because hopefully the FDA is going to take your summary of the meeting minutes into consideration when they write their final summary of the meeting minutes. If at the end you realize, oh, we didn't have a question answered fully, or we thought of another question, you might want to consider requesting an additional meeting. And with that, I'll hand this over to Rob. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. So why is the meeting important with the FDA? As Shauna has mentioned, the FDA was formed in 1906, and that was quite a long time ago. So the aspect of the FDA always changing, always evolving, it's important to be mindful that having a meeting with the FDA is not a slam dunk. It is also important to be mindful of potential failures, and planning for a positive outcome of your drug product is the ultimate goal. However, similar to the quote from Eisenhower of plans are nothing and planning is everything, there's a quote that I like from Mike Tyson, former heavyweight champion of the world. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Now, the fact of the matter is the FDA is not the adversary, but the questions that they can ask will and sometimes feel like a punch to the face. The FDA is part of the process. And as Shauna pointed out, 1906, the FDA was enacted because of adulterated baby products, adulterated foods. So the 117 years that has gone since the FDA has come into being. The end goal is the same, to protect the end patient. Now, I'm not discounting any of the feelings that you might feel, which that's why Michelle just said it's important to have an after action report. The idea of having this after action report in your planning is something that is so ultimately successful for the next round, for the next phase. Ultimately, the idea is that successful product launch. Because you have a meeting, it again does not ensure that the successful product launch. For example, have you performed all the proper safety and efficacy trials? Did you do the bare minimum to check the box or the guidance? Or did you plan to, at a minimum, to provide more data upon request? Did you cover all the blind spots? We as humans are flawed. We have blind spots, and it's important to ask meaningful questions based on previous meetings with the agency to ensure that those blind spots are taken care of. And while intense planning may initially seem like a lot of work, it is the key to achieving an incredibly successful outcome. When you meticulously map out your interactions with the agency, this will build confidence from being prepared. Smooth decision making will also arise. The ability to adapt to unexpected twists will feel like second nature. All of these elements align to make success feel not just achievable, but almost inevitable. However, pre-approval meetings, again, are not the guarantee for a successful filing. However, planning is everything in this end goal. And so, what is the impact of the meeting? And in the realm of agency engagements, the significance of a first impression cannot be overstated. When establishing a relationship with the agency in the initial encounter between you and that agency, each meeting, whether it is an interact, whether it is a type A, type B, or type C, or even a D, forms that collaboration in which the pivotal juncture that the agency is making an evaluation of your competence and reliability and compatibility with the objectives of proving the drug you want to have approved is safe and effective for that end patient. Therefore, the manner in which both parties present themselves at these interactions, at these meetings, is paramount importance. First impressions with the agency are critical for several compelling reasons, as they begin to set the tone for each interaction moving forward. The sponsor's perception of the agency's professionalism and responsiveness, along with the attention to detail, is profoundly influencing the expectations of this collaboration. However, the agency's initial evaluation of the sponsor's communication, clear, concise questions, receptiveness to the advice and commitment helps the project move forward. As a positive first impression fosters true confidence, that is fundamental to a successful partnership between you and the agency. Conversely, a negative initial interaction can undermine trust and create apprehension, poisoning a significant impediment to the effective cooperation. Furthermore, interactions with the agency can be seen as an indicator to the agency's commitment to your needs as the sponsor. It signals the agency has invested time and effort to thoroughly understand your objectives and goals with the release of your drug product. Equally, it reflects the sponsor's level of commitment and project and willingness to collaborate with the agency, and ultimately serves as a litmus test for mutual respect, communication, and alignment of these goals. A strong positive first impression lays the groundwork for harmonious, productive relationship, while a negative interaction can pose an unnecessary obstacle to achieving the sponsor's outcomes of the final drug approval. Therefore, recognizing this critical nature of the interactions that you have with the meeting, with the meeting room, how you interact with the actual agency, whether it is in Zoom, which quite frankly, 5 years ago would not have even been a thought, but thanks to COVID, we are now having these sorts of interactions almost daily. And so, again, while the agency is not an adversary, it is part of the process of the evolution of the agency's end goal to protect safety and the inpatient. So, when you ask questions of the agency, the idea of what do you want us to do is not necessarily the direction you may want to approach. As conversely, when you propose to approach a situation, would you agree? That carries much more weight. And with that, I will pass it back to Christine for audience questions and answers.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, panel. We are way ahead of schedule, so I'm looking forward to all of the questions that the participants have for us that we can address. But in the meantime, while you're putting those questions together, we have a quick polling question for you. Really quick. Are you interested in connecting with an expert from Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences? So that should be very straightforward, very easy. And one of the reasons why we're doing this is, just as you can see through the entire presentation, there's the theme, right? Be prepared. Make sure your questions are concise. Don't do the subsections, A, B, C to a question, because each of those count as part of a new question. So if you're limited to 10 and you have 25 because of all of your sub questions, you're going to get dinged for that. So there's a lot of things during the process when you're preparing to even, should I request a meeting, sometimes it is really good to have an additional pair of eyes look at it, because what you're seeing as, hey, this is great, I'm going to ask this question, from a regulatory perspective, that may not be the best way to approach the question to the FDA. Rob talked about, open-ended questions versus do you agree, or, can you confirm? Things like very specific questions will get you very specific answers. Very vague questions will get you very vague answers. So that is incredibly important. One of the other points that I do want to bring up goes back to what Michelle was talking about in, look at going to the FDA in person as if you are going to the airport. If you have people that are going to the meeting on your behalf that are non-US citizens, please ensure that the FDA is aware that you are having non-US citizens participate at least 2 weeks earlier, so that they can do their government background checks and whatever the FDA is doing to make sure that they are prepared for that meeting as well. So please make sure that any non-US citizen is clearly identified as well. So with that, let's go to the questions. So the first question that I have, let's look at Michelle and maybe you, Rob. What happens if I don't do a meeting with the FDA? What risks am I taking by not making a meeting?
Well, if you're in the pre-IND stage, the biggest risk is a clinical hold. And that's almost guaranteed to happen if you don't have a pre-IND meeting, because you may have missed something in your development program. And once you're on clinical hold, you have to get off of clinical hold, and that can be quite a lot of work.
I agree, Michelle, and I think the aspect of clinical hold is what the agency is going to be looking for in terms of data. The data that you provide to the agency is going to make or break you in the long run. And so having the risk of, a clinical hold, is that worth the reward of the time, effort, and energy that it is going to take in order to get you off of the clinical hold? I think that's a really good question.
Thank you, Rob and Michelle. Is there a limit to the number of questions that can be included in a meeting request? Subsequently, can you have, is there a limit to the number of meetings that you can have? Adam, let's have you answer that.
Sure, thank you for the question. Well, in general, the FDA recommends no more than 10 questions. And of course, the exact number will depend on the complexity of the questions that you want to include. But it's also important, to keep in mind that if there were so many questions, then it would be difficult to have meaningful discussions around each question. And also, please keep in mind that the FDA doesn't allow sub questions for each question. So you have to enumerate all the questions consecutively. For example, you can't write 1A, 1B, 1C. You have to do 1, 2, 3. So that's important to keep in mind. And thank you again for the question.
Is there a limit to the number of meetings that you can have with the FDA? Adam?
No, there are not really limits. You can submit your request again, including the relevant information. The justification for the purpose of follow-up meetings, and so there is no a fixed number of meetings that you can request.
Yeah. We didn't present any case studies in this particular presentation, but when I've been in front of the FDA, there have been times when I thought the meeting has just not gone our way, and the next day, the FDA has come back with maybe a specific, hey, please reach out to this individual. They will help you with XYZ, whichever question it was, because in the formal meeting, they can't make those types of suggestions. But to Rob's point, they're not adversarial. The medicines that we're working on help the entire world. So they do want to help you. And then there have been meetings where a client thought they did fantastic, and then they come to Cardinal and they're like, okay, that didn't go as well as we thought. Here are all the questions that we got back from the FDA that we have to answer. Is there any way you can help us? So um, you know, perhaps we should include some case studies. And if there are any questions regarding any of that, I'm sure we can come up with some answers there. Michelle, could you provide some tips for us to formulate effective questions to the FDA?
Yes, the first rule of thumb is to keep the number of words to a minimum. That both helps you consolidate exactly what you want to ask and helps those whose first language might not be English. You want to make sure your question is very clear and is on topic. And like I said, just try to keep the number of words to a minimum and make sure you have the right background so the FDA can answer that question.
Fantastic. What is the most critical piece of information to be included in a meeting request? Shauna. Oh, we can't hear you, Shauna.
Sorry, my apologies. That's a good question. The main thing is you want to be, what is the objective of the meeting? What is your most burning questions? What are the most what data do you have that gives you worry? And that's what you want to get from FDA. If you have concerns about your own data, you need to tell them that. You need to be clear, concise, as Michelle had said, and also be open to their suggestions. And again, like Rob said, you want to ask, what do you think about this? Know your objectives, know where your issues are, and ask them, because this is your one chance to get an answer from them, and you want to get as much out of the meeting as possible.
Fantastic. In thinking about this. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I was just going to dovetail on what Shauna just said. Another aspect is data transparency. You don't understand what honesty actually can get you in terms of currency with the agency. The idea of having, data transparency, to Shauna's point of this is what we have, this is what we're concerned. Ask the question of how do you, the agency, want us to bolster this. That will, help the idea of being less adversarial, being more process related, and ultimately help you with the interactions that you have with the agency.
Good point. When we're looking at, especially with recent years with COVID, face to face used to mean in person, but now face to face could be a video conference such as this. So, I would say part of the criticality, and I know it is so incredibly generic, but when you're requesting a face to face, please include whether you're looking for a face to face in person or a face to face from a video perspective, because that may change how the response that you receive. I wouldn't necessarily say length of the meeting, but it does help in making sure that you get into the meeting probably sooner rather than later, because it's a lot easier to gather folks for a video conference than it is to gather folks to be in person. Just a hint. So we do have a question that says, I'm curious to know how the regulatory process in regards to real world evidence and if there is new changes made in recent years for real world evidence. So the answer is yes, there are regulatory processes. Yes, there are changes like everything, when it's new, bright and shiny, then everything is always changing and in flux. And, let me put on my marketing hat. Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences actually has a sister company in Cardinal Health called Insights and Engagements that actually has a full team of real world evidence staff. And we work in conjunction with them. So if the data needs to be analyzed and scrutinized to go into a submission that we're assisting a client on, or if you're looking at it from an isolated, this is all I want is real world evidence information, we do have that available.
I think that that's a good point as well. With real world evidence, there's always going to be the changing landscape of not just the agency, but also as technology drives innovation and changes, there's going to be this ebb and flow, if you will, of here is a new technology that has come to the market that impacts people's everyday lives. And how does the agency and regulatory bodies respond to that real world evidence? So again, being prepared, having that plan of action so that you can interact with the agency and, bring something very beneficial to mankind forward is imperative.
Thanks, Rob. Here's a really good question and probably a really tough one for the panel. What is the process if you want to challenge an FDA response or answer to a question? So I'm going to open this up. Who wants to take first stab?
I'll jump in. I would modify the word challenge because there may be a point behind what the FDA is saying. So I first try to understand where they're coming from and then ask clarifying questions. Now, if you're already at the end of your meeting time and you still have further questions, you're going to have to schedule another meeting to get your question answered. But yeah, you're working with an agency who's going to approve your application, so you don't want to try to beat them up necessarily, but you do want to understand where they're coming from. And then once you understand that, you can ask some more clarifying questions and hopefully come to a common ground.
Yeah, I think that the key word there is challenge. It goes to the point of the adversary. The FDA is not an adversary per se. They're not the enemy. They're just part of the process. And so the process of challenging that is, to Michelle's point, understanding what their perspective around that question is. So the idea of challenging the question, it may just be as simple as asking, why did they ask that question that way?
And it could also be a basis of their understanding of the condition. I remember having one discussion about phospholipidosis, and they were insistent that this was a finding, and there's no clinical significance to this finding. And so you have to convince them and give them background. And sometimes you have a young reviewer who doesn't have the background, and you don't forget, this is your product. You know it better than anyone. So it may take a little explanation and tell them that this is why we think this way, and this is why we don't think this is a problem.
Okay, so it's how we interpret, understanding the actual questions that the FDA is asking for, and understanding why they're requesting additional data or whatever they may be requesting. And if we still have a challenge, if you will, we disagree with either conclusions or providing the additional information, we need to have very strong and resolute justification for why. So I know I've used quite a bit. We humbly request, right? So that the FDA understands and knows that we respect what they're doing and why they're doing it. But here is our justification for why we, for lack of a better word, disagree. Some good questions. Okay, a question. Any insights on how the Center for Veterinary Medicine might differ from the human side?
I could take that.
All right,
With
it's you.
with veterinary medicine, you have to be careful, like residuals, differences in metabolism from different species, the indications. So that's how it differs pretty much. I mean, if you have antibiotics, there's always residuals in the meat. You want to make sure what's the exposure, how is it measured. So that's some aspects that makes it a little different. And the species, of course, species differences have a huge impact on and the indications on what your package will look like.
Thanks, Shauna. It's pretty interesting because a lot of the CMC aspects between veterinary and human are identical, right?
Very
You
much
still
so.
have to identify the molecule. You still have to, explain your process. You have to talk through the packaging. So there are a lot of similarities, but to Shauna's point, there's a lot of disparity when it comes to, okay, are these animals, for food? Are these
Mhm.
animals that are pets? And that absolutely has to be taken into consideration.
Right. And a big part of it is also, to Christine's point about CMC impurities. That's always a major issue. And how, are they residuals, but also how it's metabolized, as I mentioned, and what are the, genotoxic, whatever, ramifications of having those impurities present in the product.
Thank you, Shauna. So we still have some time. Are there any additional questions that the audience may have? Okay, so what I'd like to do now, and the panel is totally not prepared for this, I would like to ask each of you what your major takeaway is when getting ready or preparing a meeting for the FDA. So Shauna, what's your takeaway?
Takeaway is be prepared, be ready, know your data, and be very concise and be very to the point. You only get one chance. And so you want to make sure that you get as much out of it as possible.
Yeah, one chance for a first impression. Adam?
As Rob said.
I would say that something that is really key is to formulate the questions, the questions that you want to include in the meeting. I think that's something key, one of the most important aspects of the meeting.
Thanks, Adam. Rob?
So from my perspective, there is no detail that is too small. Michelle talked about the meeting room. Is the meeting room actually big enough for everyone to have space to do the job that they are tasked with? The other aspect is, have you identified redundancies? Michelle also talked about the note taker. What happens if the note taker is 8 months pregnant and has a baby? that's kind of life happening. Did you plan? Did you anticipate that unexpected thing? I think the aspect of dealing with the FDA, to Shauna's point, is you never get that, second chance to make a first impression. And that is so critical in the planning. Did you plan for X? If you plan for every outcome, then any surprise is going to be a pleasant one.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Rob.
Well said.
And last but certainly not least, Michelle.
I would say prepare, and when you think you're prepared, go back and prepare some more. Keep looking at everything and make sure you've got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, I want to thank the audience for being here today with us. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences, and we'll do what we can to answer your questions when we receive them.
Thank you. Thank you again to all of our participants for attending this Fierce Pharma webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also really like to thank our speakers for participating and Cardinal Health for presenting today's webinar. A recorded version of this webinar will be available for you to access within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.